Actually, it's not that great at the moment. I mean, fans have already snapped up tickets to see high-profile athletes such as I mentioned, Olympic swimming champion Park Tae-wan. But overall, the sales of the event are dragging.
We'll come back to that interview later on in our program. You're listening to Asia News Weekly, a digest from the Asia Pacific region. Matthew Miller gets 6 years in North Korea. Uighurs are sentenced for China's 9/11, and the Asian Games bring the best athletes to South Korea. Those stories and more are on the September 19th edition of Asia News Weekly. Welcome to the show, everyone. I'm your host, Steve Miller, and I want to thank you so much for downloading and listening to this week's program. This summer, when news of American Matthew Miller's April arrest in North Korea broke, most of the world scratched their head and let out a giant WTF. Miller went through China on a DPRK tour, and while in immigration, he tore up his visa and asked for asylum. It should be noted that those reports have either come from the KCNA, the North Korean official news agency, or Miller, under the direct supervision of the DPRK, and it's unclear exactly how true that story is. North Korea says that Miller was an agent of a Western power and desired to go undercover in a North Korean prison to expose the truth. Miller was therefore charged with espionage and, of course, found guilty. His sentence, 6 years hard labor. Miller, as well as Kenneth Bae and Jeffery Fowle, were granted opportunities to speak with the press before the trial. In those interviews, Miller looked, well, I'm just going to say it, he looked odd. He appeared distraught, he appeared distracted. It was clear he was under duress and that he was being carefully watched, and his answers coached. U.S. State Department spokeswoman Marie Harf made it known that the government was employing various methods to get the American citizens freed.
We have requested the DPRK immediately release him and the other detained Americans so they can return home. As we've said, we don't always publicly outline all of the ways we are working to return our citizens home, but we are very focused on this and have called on the DPRK to release him.
Throughout this entire matter, Kim Jong-un has been playing hardball, refusing to budge his position, clearly using the Americans as political bargaining chips. Why? Bruce Bennett, senior defense analyst with the Rand Corporation, said Kim appears to be insecure in his position, having removed 4 different defense ministers in the past 2.5 years, turned over his chief of the general staff 3 times, and killed his uncle, the former vice chairman of the National Defense Commission, Jung Song-taek. He feels North Korea may be seeking another high-profile American visit, having released detained Americans following trips by former Presidents Jimmy Carter and Bill Clinton in 2010 and 2009 respectively. Bennett also says, as far as the North Koreans are concerned, there is no such thing as a former president. All their presidents still serve, even though they're dead. And so, as far as they're concerned, President Clinton was still an American president, and in Asian culture, the weaker leader always goes to the stronger leader and pays his obeisance, or differential respect. Bennett says he thinks Kim Jong-un needs that kind of situation now, and he's got sufficient instability, and he needs the Americans to help him out. Bennett is right. Having Clinton and Carter visit North Korea made the United States appear weaker than the DPRK. If Kim can get another president to make the trip, it would go a long way in solidifying his position. It's that exact reason why I oppose Clinton and Carter going to North Korea, both in 2009 and again in 2010. In a similar WTF moment, the South Korean military says it detained a U.S. citizen earlier this week who apparently was trying to swim across the Han River into North Korea. The Yonhap news agency reported that the man, who appeared to be in his 30s, was found lying on the shore apparently exhausted from swimming. The man told officials he wanted to meet with Kim Jong-un. South Korean soldiers last year also shot and killed a South Korean man who tried to cross another river into North Korea. Despite all this, tourism to North Korea continues to grow. Quote, "This idea of a country that no one else is really allowed to visit always fascinated me," said Culver City resident Cyrus Kirkpatrick, who's 27 and has gone to North Korea twice, and most recently in 2013. Estimates place between 4,000 and 6,000 Western visitors annually. The U.S. State Department warns against it, noting that just because one is on a tour, there's no guarantee you won't be detained. Given the current state of North Korea, personally, that's advice one should strongly consider. Earlier in the week, I shared a story and asked the question, should the U.S. ask for a pardon for the Americans being detained? Some said yes, do everything possible for their release, and some said, let them rot. It sounds cold, but I'm more inclined to agree with the second camp. All three of the men committed crimes. Now, their conditions are harsh and their sentences truly unfair, but there are larger issues at play, and going the extra mile to get these Americans out may not be in the United States' best interests. With Miller getting 6 years in this particular case, it really doesn't seem as if the espionage threat was too real, considering that Bay got 15 years for proselytizing. Fowle is expected to go on trial soon, and, as with Miller, he'll be found guilty. I suspect his sentence will be more along the lines of Bay, getting somewhere between 6 and 15 years. How do you feel about North Korea's verdict, and should the United States satisfy Kim's request and send a high-level envoy? Be sure to let me know in the comments. In just a moment, a line dance of a different nature as the Philippines takes China to task. The March 1st knife attacks at a train station in Kunming, China, are often referred to as China's 9/11. It was an absolutely brutal event, resulting in 140 people being wounded and 30 dead. Many of the attackers were Uighurs, a Muslim minority, often accused of terrorist actions in Xinjiang. Last week, 4 attackers went on trial. State prosecutors said 3 of the suspects were arrested while attempting to cross China's border. The other took part in the attack, along with at least 4 other assailants whom police shot dead on the scene. The Chinese courts have a near 100% conviction rate in these cases, and the sentence typically handed down is death. And that's exactly what happened. The 3 men on trial were given the death penalty, and the lone woman was given life in prison, only because she's pregnant. According to authorities, between February 24th and February 26th, the group held many discussions at a barbershop in the Shadian district of Jeju, a city in the Yunnan province, and decided to launch a terrorist attack with knives in crowded places like railway stations. Militants from Xinjiang are also accused of organizing an explosive attack in the regional capital of Urumqi, which killed 31 people this past May. They're also accused of a suicide car crash in Beijing's Tiananmen Square last year. Rights groups blame unrest in Xinjiang on cultural and religious repression of the Uighurs, who sometimes attempt to escape China and seek asylum in Southeast Asia. The knife attacks have had a lasting effect on Kunming, with a large police presence at shopping malls and train stations to this day. Gui Junwen, a Hui Muslim and director of the Yongni Mosque, says it could take up to 5 years to overcome the impact of the attacks. Quote, "There are those in Kunming who are directly linking the Muslim religion to terrorism. However, gradually, Muslims here are working to turn that around, communicating and building understanding. Most Muslims in Yunnan are ethnic Hui and have long gotten along well with the Chinese. According to residents, only a small minority of rogue elements of society are those who commit such acts. Kunming is the home to many religious faiths, and Yunnan boasts more than 20 ethnic minorities, but residents say the violence risks undermining that reputation. In related news, China has begun its trial of Uighur scholar Ilham Tohti, a highly regarded academic who has criticized China's policies in Xinjiang. Chinese authorities have charged the former economics professor with separatism, a charge he denies. Security was tight outside the court in Xinjiang's capital of Urumqi, where the trial took place. It's unclear when the verdict will be announced. One of Tohti's lawyers said, "Many of the testimonies were illogical, and that's why we raised doubts. Why were the organizers and members of the secessionist forces brought to trial separately? The security forces have investigated the case as a group of 8 secessionists, but split their trials." Ilham was also very annoyed about it, and in this respect, there was no justice in the trial. A U.S. Embassy spokesman says Tohti's arrest silenced an important Uighur voice that peacefully promoted harmony and understanding among China's ethnic groups, particularly Uyghurs. The U.S. also mentioned to China the difference between peaceful dissent and violent extremism and have called for Tohti's release. Earlier this week, 4 Uyghurs were also arrested in Indonesia, suspected of trying to recruit members for the Islamic State. If you'd like to know more about this or any of the stories mentioned in the podcast, please take a look at the show notes available at asiannewsweekly.net. The Asian Games start today, and we'll have more on that in just a few minutes. Since China unveiled its 9-dash line, it's caused quite the stir in the region. This summer, China upgraded their map to include 10-dash lines. It still includes almost 90% of the South and East China Seas, Taiwan, and more importantly, valuable trade routes and natural resources. China claims the drawn boundaries have historically always been part of China. Since releasing the maps, China has strategically laid claim to overlapping areas, most notably with Vietnam and the Philippines. The international community doesn't recognize China's new maritime boundaries and continues to call for all parties in the dispute to come together and negotiate an amicable solution. The Philippines earlier this year brought its case to the United Nations Arbitral Court in The Hague, seeking a ruling under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. However, China has refused to take part in that arbitration, and a non-binding ruling is expected late next year. Last week, the Philippines also decided to play the historical map game and refute the Chinese claims on the Scarborough Shoal. In an effort to protect suspected oil, natural gas, and rich fishing grounds, Philippine officials unveiled an exhibition of old maps at a university. The maps on display cover a period of almost 1,000 years, from the Song dynasty in the year 960 until the end of the Qing dynasty early in the 20th century. During that time, according to the maps, we should respect historical facts, not historical lies, said Supreme Court Associate Justice Antonio Carpio, who has done extensive research on the territorial disputes. The facts, according to Carpio, were shown on the ancient maps, both official and unofficial. Carpio also said the exhibition could be viewed online and that it would help everyone in all claimant states understand the facts, either to restrain extreme nationalism fueled by historical lies, or give hope to a just and durable settlement of disputes. Exhibition organizers state that the Scarborough Shoal never appeared in any old Chinese maps, but on numerous ancient maps made by foreigners and Filipinos, some as early as 1636. Throughout all that period, the rocky outcrop was consistently shown to be Philippine territory. It's naive of the Philippines to think that China will change its position based on the display. At the same time, it may help garner international support for their position. The Philippine position also shows restraint and adherence to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS. However, China hasn't shown any interest in following UNCLOS or even nailing down the proposed code of conduct for the region. Everyone knows a comprehensive and fair solution must be reached, and the problem is finding exactly what that solution is, and finding a process where China is willing to participate and be fully engaged in. There needs to be a reason for China to come to the table, and right now, there isn't one. It has the might to dictate terms, and that's exactly what it's doing. The United States and Japan aren't forcing the issue, and ASEAN members are simply too weak to force it themselves. Suhit Siddharthan mentioned in our September 5th program that perhaps Singapore might be able to bring everyone to the table and coordinate an amicable solution. Suhit will return to our Asia Now program on Wednesday, September 24th, discussing the controversy over the competing claims on what Japan calls the Senkaku Islands and China calls Diaoyu. It's an episode you don't want to miss given its regional importance. In just a few moments, the Weekly Brief, a collection of stories to help you stay better informed about the region. Beginning today, September 19th, the 2014 Asian Games officially open in Incheon, South Korea. What are these games and what can we expect? Joining me by phone from the Korea Times is Kim Tae-jung to answer just that. Tae-jung, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I am fantastic. Thanks for asking. Tae-jung, I was wondering if you could do me a favor and paint a picture. Give us a brief overview of what the games are.
Sure. The Asian Games, also called as the Asian, is the Olympics of Asian countries. It first began in 1978 in New Delhi and since has been enjoying a rising profile as Asia countries grow as a source of world-beating athletic talent. The Incheon Asian Game is the 17th edition, which will take place from this Friday to October 4th. Incheon is the third most populous city in Korea and also the third city to host the event after Seoul in 1986 and Busan in 2002. And it will welcome some 15,000 athletes and officials from 45 countries, including North Korea. They will compete in 36 sports to prove they are the best in the region.
So, what exactly can we expect to see during these games?
One of the highlights is the events is the opening ceremony. According to the organizing committee, it will be led by the nation's veteran director Im Kwon-taek and produced by popular film director Jang Jin. It seems that the event will spare no expense with approximately 20 billion won invested and some 3,800 people participating in the show. Basically, it's going to be a big Hallyu or Korean wave concert with many K-pop stars and Korean actors showing up. It can be fun for Asians because Korean pop culture has been so popular throughout Asia in recent years. And you can also expect some rivalries because heated rivalries will be a highlight at the Incheon Asian Games. For example, swimmer Park Tae-hwan and gymnast Yang Hak-sun and Son Yeon-jae, these athletes will take on their Asian rivals on home soil during the Asian Games. Also, the North Korea will participate in this event, and North Korea has sent its delegation to Asia. The delegation from the world's most isolated country is drawing much attention already from media ahead of the start of the Incheon Asian Games. The North Korean delegation includes 150 athletes, and they will compete in 14 sports, such as football, swimming, archery, judo, weightlifting, and so on.
Yeah, North Korea has also already racked up one win earlier this week.
Yes.
Now, I do have a question for you. How have ticket sales been going for the events?
Actually, it's not that great at the moment. I mean, fans have already snapped up tickets to see high-profile athletes such as I mentioned, Olympic swimming champion Park Tae-hwan. But overall, the sales of the event are dragging. According to Incheon organizing committee, as of Monday, overall ticket sales has reached only 18% for the 36 sports, as well as the opening and closing ceremonies. This is obviously disappointing, although a lot of politicians, including Incheon Mayor Yoo Jung-bo, stress the long-term gains in tourism will help offset the cost. And now a lot of people are now worried that the city's debt burden grows after the games, and many of the new sports facilities are no longer of use.
Right. And I've even seen some reports that many of the unpopular sporting events have ticket sales of only around 5 or 6%.
Right.
Kim Tae-jung is the assistant sports editor of the Korea Times. He'll be joining me again on the October 1st edition of Asia Now to talk more about them in depth. Tae-jung, thank you for joining me today.
Okay, great.
One interesting aspect of the Games is how South Korea is enforcing its national security law. It's a relic of the Cold War with the DPRK and prohibits South Koreans from showing any form of support for North Korea. South Koreans are banned from possessing the flag, which may only be displayed within the confines of the sports arena during matches, and is also prohibited from being displayed within the athlete's village or other outside areas. North Korean athletes and officials are permitted to fly the flag for cheering purposes, but only within the stadium while games or award ceremonies relevant to North Korea are underway. Some state fear of vandalism as the reason for the restrictions on the North Korean flag, but honestly, if South Korea is going to place that many restrictions on a piece of cloth, why even bother letting North Korea participate in the Games if they're going to be so unhospitable and display poor sportsmanship from the get-go? Don't miss our other podcasts, The Asia Brief and Asia Now. The Asia Brief is released Monday through Thursday mornings and gives you a glimpse into the region's top stories. Asia Now is released every Wednesday and features stories and interviews. This week on Asia Now, how expats deal with holiday homesickness. And now for the weekly brief. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott said an anti-terrorism raid Thursday was prompted by an Islamic State figure who has ordered demonstration killings in Australia. Quote, "That's the intelligence we received." The exhortations, quite direct exhortations, were coming from an Australian who is apparently quite senior in ISIL to networks of support back in Australia to conduct demonstration killings here in this country. So this is not just suspicion, this is intent, and that's why the police and security agencies decided to act in the way that they have. End quote. Officials say militants planned to abduct a random Australian, wrap the victim in an Islamic State flag, and behead him. About 800 Australian police officers carried out pre-dawn raids in Sydney, Brisbane, and Logan, arresting 15 people. China's President Xi Jinping conducted a three-nation tour of South Asia with a historic visit to the Maldives, an island paradise gaining a reputation as a hotbed of militant Islamists. Xi traveled there partly because the Maldives is a popular tourist destination for Chinese citizens. It's the first visit by a leader from Beijing since the former British protectorate gained independence in 1965. Xi then traveled to Sri Lanka and India. The United States said it was justified in monitoring China, despite objections, noting a lack of transparency in China's military buildup, a senior U.S. official said last week. China had asked the United States to cease or at least scale back operations in an effort to mend ties. Assistant Secretary of State Daniel Russell, the senior U.S. diplomat for East Asia, said, quote, "We have the right to conduct legitimate missions outside of China's territorial space, and there is a persuasive rationale for doing so. Frankly, the lack of transparency in China's military modernization is the source of some concern to its neighbors, and we believe that all of the region, including China, would benefit from increased transparency." End quote. Russell then pointed to China's hard press in the South China Sea as a prime example. Nearly half of all girls in South Asia marry before they turn 18, according to a United Nations report that lays bare what it calls glaring inequities. Published by the UN Children's Agency UNICEF, the report also revealed that more than 1 million newborn babies still die every year in the region, often due to inadequate health care. South Asia continues to be one of the riskiest places in the world to become pregnant or to give birth, with the second highest number of maternal deaths worldwide, said Karen Hulshoff, Regional Director for UNICEF in South Asia. Hulshoff continues, "Far too many children get married, and far too many girls are never born." 20% of young girls are married before the age of 15, giving the region the highest rates of child marriage in the world. The report was timed with the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child and noted significant improvements in the 8 Asian countries monitored. China, Japan, and South Korea held their first high-level trilateral meeting since November of 2013. Held in Seoul, South Korean Deputy Foreign Minister for Political Affairs Lee Kyung-soo, Japanese Deputy Foreign Minister Shinsuke Sugiyama, and Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Liu Zhenmin met to discuss their relationships and to consider the potential for holding a trilateral summit between the top leaders of their respective nations. As expected, there was no movement on that particular issue. However, another foreign minister level meeting is expected before the end of the year. It's the right time for us to revitalize this cooperation, building trust and removing stumbling blocks, said South Korea's foreign minister. On that particular note, China once more pushed for a regional security plan, inviting the defense chiefs from South Korea, North Korea, and Japan to the Xinjiang Forum Regional Security Conference later this year. The conference will be organized by the Chinese Defense Ministry and will take place from November 20th to November 22nd. The forum is a bi-yearly Track 2 defense exchange that mostly involves defense scholars. It appears China is trying to elevate the forum as a self-hosted Shangri-La forum as it pushes its Asia for Asians mantra and outs the United States from security matters. For more on that, check our show notes for the link to the July 21st, 2014 Asia Now episode with Curtis Chen. Those are all the stories for this week's show, but let's hear what you had to say last time. First up, a bit of feedback from Chris Lay. He left a message on our Facebook page asking us to take a look at the information presented in each podcast. As a listener from outside of South Korea, he was beginning to feel that too many of the stories were focused on the peninsula. As always, not only do I value your comments, but I value your criticism. Every week we take a look at our show and refine certain elements, so please do take the time to let us know what you like and what you don't. Anthony Murphy, who not only contributed to our last episode, left a comment agreeing that Suhit Sutarthan's premise that Singapore might provide a key to regional stability showed some important insight. And finally, Critique Cat had this to say about Hong Kong. My opinion is that what China wants to do is to create something like Hong Kong when it was under British rule. Hong Kong was back then, and is still to this day, the freest economy in the world. No tariffs, no income tax, no restrictions, and very few regulations. They had social and economic freedom, but not a political one. The head of state was the Queen. They had free speech and all that, but they couldn't vote. So I would guess China wants to do something like that. They want to remain in power forever, and to ensure higher living standards and maximum freedom to people. I don't think they can do that though, because the people are not going to be happy not voting for their representatives, and in order to suppress people, the government needs to get involved. And the more you get involved, the more you hurt the economy. So it's going to have to be a choice between either a free economy or government intervention. You can't have both. So it's safe to say, in my opinion, it's a matter of time before China becomes even more democratic, one way or the other. Thank you again to everyone who left comments last time. I truly do value them, and I hope you'll take a moment to leave some of your thoughts about the stories we covered this week. You can do that on our webpage, on our Facebook page, or even through Twitter. If you haven't found us on social media, our Facebook page is facebook.com/Asia News Weekly. And of course, we're at Asia News Weekly on Twitter. If you'd rather send us a voice comment, you can dial up Asia News Weekly on Skype. And when you leave your voicemail message, just be sure to include your name and where you're calling from. You can also send your audio comment through email or leave questions or feedback for the show. Just drop a line to asiannewsweekly@gmail.com. You can play and download all of our episodes on websites like the Korea Times, Japan Today, Asia Pundits, but if you prefer the show in podcast form, look for us on iTunes, Stitcher, and TuneIn Radio. And if you truly enjoyed this episode, please share it with your friends and subscribe so you won't miss the next one. Thank you again for listening. For Asia News Weekly, I'm Steve Miller, reminding you to be true to yourself and always be awesome. Asia News Weekly is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License.